We're continuing this week, having undergone a whole lot of intellectual stuff last week with the ontological arguments. We're going to go ahead to the cosmological arguments. And basically, that is the arguments that come from the beginning and the study of the universe. Now, before we get started in any of this, there are times I will use the term the Big Bang. Does that mean that I believe the world came into existence with a Big Bang 13 billion years ago? No, it's just a very easy way to quickly say the start of the universe, the beginning of the universe, okay? For those of you who don't know, by the way, I don't know if you guys realize this, the phrase the Big Bang was actually a jab at people who originally thought that the universe came into existence out of nothing. Ex nihilo is the term you'll hear. And one scientist basically was making fun of it because at that time, scientists oftentimes, or for the most part, thought the universe was eternal in existence, that it did not have a beginning. And so when it was proposed, when the theory that ultimately became known as the Big Bang became proposed, one of the other scientists who didn't agree with it jokingly called it, oh yeah, it got started in a Big Bang. And so that's actually how we get the term. So it was actually a spoof on it, which is funny that now everybody talks about the Big Bang. But we're going to be talking about actually several different variations to cosmological arguments. And some of them have to do with time, so they'd be what we call temporal cosmological arguments. And then some of them actually don't have to do with time at all. Okay, and the first one we'll look at is the Leibnitzian cosmological argument. I know that's a mouthful, but Leibniz is the guy who came up with it. But it's actually an atemporal cosmological argument, which means that even if the universe were eternal in existence, which all evidence points against that, but even if it were, the Leibnizian argument actually still would hold true. So it actually doesn't matter whether it came into existence at a point in time or whether it were universal in the past. Leibniz, by the way, was a theist. And just as a point of, I always like to kind of go back over some of our base points, a deductive argument is one that starts with at least two premises and has a conclusion. And as long as the two premises are true and follow each other, then the conclusion, as long as it follows, that argument is said to be valid and sound. Okay, so you have to have true premises and they have to lead to the conclusion, right? And I've used this argument or this example before. All humans are animals. Jim is a human, therefore Jim is an animal. Okay, now the second of the last of the cosmological arguments that we talk about, the Kalam, it is a deductive argument. Okay, but oftentimes we'll be talking about inductive arguments, which again are arguments to the best explanation. Okay. Remember also that all of our beliefs, in this case, we're still on God exists. That's the belief we're talking about. God exists. Always has reasons, and we call those reasons, in this case, theistic arguments. And so now we're on to our second set of theistic arguments, and that is the cosmological argument. So the first question is, what the heck does that mean? So what is cosmology? Cosmology is the study of philosophy, actually, and science that deals with the origins and general structure of the universe. Not the details of the universe. Okay, the details of the universe would be things like astronomy and physics and chemistry, but the general structure and makeup of the cosmos. Okay? So understand too that in ancient Hebrew, there is no exact equivalent of the word universe. That's why when you see in Genesis 1, God created the heavens and the earth. Heavens, whenever they wanted to talk about the cosmos, the universe, that's the phrase they would use, the heavens and the earth. Okay? So they are synonymous terms. They are synonymous terms. Because believe it or not, there are people that would ask, well, it never says God created the universe. It said God created the heavens and the earth. That's the Hebrew way of saying the universe, the cosmos, what exists. Okay? And again, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And of course, in Colossians, it also says, for by him all things were made, were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. Speaking of God, of course. In point of review, right, we talked last week about some definitions. Impossible, necessary, contingent. Okay? Impossible is an entity that cannot exist. No matter what, it cannot exist. A round triangle cannot exist. A square with 3 sides cannot exist. Okay? A married bachelor cannot exist. No matter what hypothetical or imaginary or possible world there is, a married bachelor can't exist because it's a definition, right? A contingent being is a being that can exist in some possible worlds, but not all. Now, I'm going to add a little bit to that. A contingent being also requires something else. It is contingent upon something else. Okay? Easy thing. A book is contingent upon a writer. Actually, and a publisher. Right? A computer is contingent upon a computer engineer. Okay? Piece of furniture is contingent upon the furniture maker. And then necessary is that it has to exist in all possible worlds. And we talked about it last time. There are several things that many philosophers believe are necessary beings, even beyond God, and that are things like numbers, absolute truths. We've talked a lot about the law of non-contradiction, right? That is a necessary law. It doesn't matter what possible world you can think up, you can't think up a world where an orange is an orange and not an orange at the same time in the same manner. It's impossible, right? And then shape definitions. Like I said, you can't have a round triangle, you can't have a 3-sided square. It is impossible, right? Okay, when we start talking about cosmological arguments, the first thing we need to do is answer the question that Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz posed back in the 1600s, which is, why is there something rather than nothing? Now, in my personal opinion, this is the question that science cannot answer, because it's a philosophical question, right? You can explain the inner workings of all that exists to the finest degree, but science can never answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Have you ever thought about it? Why is there a universe? That's what Leibniz started his philosophy of his cosmological argument with. Why is there something? Why do we exist? Why does the universe exist? Why does any universe exist? And by the way, again, his is an atemporal cosmological argument. So it actually wouldn't matter, because scientists have tried to say, well, we're just one universe of multiple universes. Doesn't matter. Why do the multiple universes exist? Right? And again, even if the universe were eternal, you still got to ask the question, why does it exist? Why does something exist rather than nothing? Have you ever thought about that question for a moment? I mean, a lot of times people will say, well, I've thought about, well, why am I here? Or why did this event happen? But think about it. You could take that back to as big as it gets, the whole universe. Why does the universe exist? So the Leibnizian cosmological argument has several steps to it. Remember, with deductive arguments, you have to have at least 2, but you can have more. And his first one is this. Anything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Either it is a necessary being, or it has an external explanation. Okay? Now, that's a version of what we call the principle of sufficient reason, which Leibniz came up with. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Premise 2, the universe has an explanation for its existence, and that explanation is grounded in the necessary being. Third one, The universe exists. Fourth one, therefore the universe has an explanation for its existence. Because if you have 1 plus 3, 4 follows, right? Therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is grounded in a necessary being, and that comes from 2 and 4. And the conclusion is, therefore, God exists. Now, it seems pretty complicated. I'm going to break it down. This is why I said this may be 2 weeks. We may have to cover this one in 1 week and the Kalam in the second week. That's fine. Because I want you guys to understand this, because honestly, once you understand it, it's pretty airtight. Okay? So the first is this. Anything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Either it is a necessary being or it has an external cause. In other words, it's a contingent being. Okay? Now, again, that is it is basically just a stated version of what we call the principle of sufficient reason. In other words, everything has a reason for its existence. That seems logical. It seems very straightforward, right? So the technical way of saying that is for every fact F, there must be a sufficient reason why F exists, right? For every book, there's a reason that book exists. Maybe more than one reason. For every table, there's a reason for the existence of that table. Right? In fact, all science is based on the principle of sufficient reason. In fact, the goal of science is often, especially like chemistry, I was a chemist, is to figure out what is the reason that X or Y compound exists. In physics, it's how does it exist? Right? Everybody following so far? Okay. So, like I said before, if we deny that everything that exists has an explanation, then the reality is you cannot do science. Science is based 100% on the principle of sufficient reason. If I combine A plus B and get C, then A and B combined in this way gives me C. They are the sufficient reason for C. Very straightforward. So if anyone starts denying the principle of sufficient reason, just turn around and walk away. Right? You're wasting your time at that point, because what they're then saying is anything can pop into existence unexplained out of nothing. That is not how science works. That is not how life works. That's not how any of us would expect the world to go. Right? Who here has ever experienced something popping into existence out of nothing? Not me. Not anyone. Okay? So, because of that, it's pretty clear that premise number one, that anything that exists has an explanation for its existence. Either it is a necessary being, in other words, it has to exist, or it has an external explanation. Right? Now, why does it have to be a necessary being? Can anybody think of a reason why it has to be a necessary being and not another contingent being? Right? Because I'll give you an example of how contingent things work. I have a son. I am the reason for my son's existence. He is a contingent being. He's contingent upon me being here. Right? I have a reason for my existence. My mother and my father. I am contingent upon them having met back in 1902 and had me. They are both contingent upon their parents, and on and on. Those are contingent reasons for being. The problem is when you start talking about the universe, it can't just simply keep going back in infinitum. It can't. At some point, you have to say there is a necessary reason that this exists. Now, there are people who say that the universe is that necessary thing, that all things in the universe have a reason for their existence, but the universe just is. It doesn't need an explanation. Now, does that seem very philosophical to you guys? No. William Lane Craig oftentimes calls it the taxi cab fallacy. Because when you're riding in a taxi cab, you can just tell the taxi cab driver, "Oh, stop, I'm getting off here." In other words, what he's saying about that argument and why it's a fallacy is that you're just simply going and going and going and going until you get to a spot where you want to stop and you say, "Nope, I'm stopping here. This is my necessary being," that being the universe. But see, the problem with that is this. Could the universe not have existed?
Yeah, I got this. So, like, for anything to exist at any particular point in space and time, you have to have a space and time for a point to exist.
Correct.
To have the universe, that you would therefore have no space and point and time to exist.
That's correct.
Making a necessary entity.
Exactly. At some point, you have to have an uncaused first cause, right? Now, there's a couple problems with atheist philosophers saying, well, the universe is the uncaused first cause. Problem number one, all science points to the fact that the universe, meaning all time, space, and matter, came into existence in an instant. Nothing can create anything, right? The Latin for it is ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes, right? That's what I was saying. None of us have ever or will ever experience something popping into existence out of nothing, right? So once you get to the universe beginning, you have to have a cause that existed out of necessity. The atheist would say the universe exists out of necessity. It just is, and it doesn't need an explanation. The problem is that fails like philosophy 101, right? Because there is nothing about the universe that has to exist.
Because science is already proven it has an end, so therefore
It had a beginning. That's right. That's right. So something had to exist outside of time, space, and matter that brought the universe into existence. You can't create something out of nothing. The universe certainly couldn't have created itself. That is a philosophical problem, right? For something to create itself, it would have had to exist before it created itself, which defeats about a bazillion different things in philosophy, right? It can't exist beforehand, otherwise it would already exist. So to create itself, it would have to be pre-existent. That's illogical. It doesn't make any sense, right?
an orange and under an orange at the same time, the same place.
Exactly. Exactly. So it seems very logical, I think, to all of us that the universe has an explanation for its existence. His statement then was that explanation is grounded in a necessary being. And we just went over why it can't be the necessary being. Because remember what we describe or define necessary as. It exists in all possible worlds. It can't not exist. And I know that's a double negative, but it cannot not exist. It must exist. Well, the universe just as easily could have not existed. Therefore, the universe cannot be the necessary first cause of everything else. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions about that before we go on?
Because you could think of a universe that did not exist.
That's right. Right, we can imagine a non-existence of the universe. That's right. Exactly. That's exactly the point. We can imagine that the universe never came into existence. Obviously, it did come into existence, but we can imagine it didn't. That's exactly right, Dave. Absolutely. So, that one seems pretty straightforward. Number 3, I don't think anyone in reality is going to argue with you that the universe exists. Now, there are some online YouTube atheists, I am sure, who have, and I can never remember which color pill it was in The Matrix, because honestly, I hated that movie, but who took the whatever pill to really realize that, we don't actually exist, we're just a computer animation of our existence or whatever. Again, I hated that movie. But we talked about this last week. The reality is you cannot really prove almost anything. That's why Descartes is famous for saying, I think, therefore I am. And he basically said, that's the only thing I can actually prove. I can't actually even prove that this computer's sitting in front of me, or what I ate for lunch today, or anything else for that matter. But if they're willing to argue with you that the universe exists, again, turn around, walk away, say bye, I'm sorry, there's no reason for this to have this conversation. Okay? You're wasting your time. The 4th one, therefore the universe has an explanation for its existence. Again, that simply follows from 1 and 3. Remember, 1 says anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in a necessary being or in another contingent being. And 3 says the universe exists. So it's almost not even the next step. But 4 simply follows from 1 and 3, the universe has an explanation for its existence. And 5, therefore the explanation of the existence of the universe is grounded in a necessary being. That's what we actually just got done talking about here a couple minutes ago. And we'll talk a little more about it here in just a second. And of course then the conclusion, which does follow logically from the 5 steps, is that God, a necessary being, exists. And as one YouTube video I watched by William Lane Craig, it basically says, if you don't want to call it God, simply call it a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, all-powerful creator of the universe, if you don't like the word God. I prefer to use a one-syllable word, God, but it's up to you. Okay? So that holds. Now, let's talk a little bit more detail about this argument, okay? Because I really want you guys to get this one down, because again, we're talking about an argument where you never have to pick up a Bible. Remember, this is an atemporal argument. It wouldn't matter if the universe were eternal in the past. This argument would still be there, because there would still be the question, why does an eternal universe exist rather than nothing? Okay? Bertrand Russell, very famous atheist philosopher, said, we cannot ask about the cause of the universe, it's just there, and that's all. This is one of the men that academic atheists love to quote, Bertrand Russell. Okay? David Hume. David Hume is the father of skepticism. Basically, David Hume said that anything that I can't sense with my 5 senses, I can't prove. That's basically what Hume said. And he said, the universe exists necessarily. It is what we reason everything else from. The problem is, Russell and Hume both would have failed Philosophy 101 for that statement. It just exists and there's no explanation. The study of philosophy is the study of thought and logic and reason. How logical, how reasonable is it to simply say it has an explanation, or it doesn't need an explanation, it just is? That's literally turning off your brain. I would fail them in a Philosophy 101 course for that. We're oftentimes accused of having God of the gaps theology. Meaning if we don't have an explanation, we just say, well, God knows. That's what they say. Now, I don't believe Christianity is a God of the gaps belief system, But I will tell you that when you simply say the universe just exists and there's no explanation for it, that's atheism of the gaps. That's you simply saying, I'm stopping here because I, in my naturalistic, atheistic worldview, I can't come up with a reasonable explanation for the universe. That's what that is. And so they simply say, it is what it is. Where else do we simply say, it is what it is? Especially in science and logic and reason. We don't. That is atheism of the gaps. Okay? Let me give you a hardcore example of this. Say me and Dave are walking along in the woods and we're hiking 5 miles out. We're in the middle of nowhere. In fact, somehow we figured out we're actually hiking where no human had ever hiked before. And we come across this glowing, translucent ball sitting on the floor of the forest. And I look down at it and I go, Dave, check that out. And he says to me, yeah, it's kind of interesting, huh? I said, yeah. Wonder how that thing got there. And Dave says to me, it just is what it is. It just exists. It doesn't have an explanation. Let's keep going. Now, you're going to think one of two things when Dave says this to me. Either Dave just doesn't care and he just wants us to keep hiking. That's possible. Probable, yeah. Or he is off his rocker. But the point is, if you're walking along and a glowing, translucent spherical ball is sitting on the floor of the forest, no one is going to walk by it and say, that glowing, translucent ball in the forest just is, with no explanation to why it's sitting there. Everybody agree? Well, what if, instead of being the size of a basketball, it's the size of a VW bug? Does that change the scenario? No. What about if it was the size of a quarter of the earth? Does it change the scenario that if you're walking along and see the translucent ball has an explanation of its origin? No, it doesn't change it. The size of the ball doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's the size of the Earth, the size of the Milky Way galaxy, or our solar system, or the size of the entire universe. You see, the universe itself has an explanation for its existence. And that explanation cannot be another contingent thing. It has to be a necessary being. Now, for the universe to be necessary, it would have to be eternal, lasting forever. It cannot fail to exist. Remember what we said about necessary beings. They can't not exist. Right? And it has to be changeless. The problem is we know the universe is changing. We know the universe is expanding. We know stars are burning out. It's not changeless. Now some might say, why couldn't it be a necessary substance? Right? Maybe before there was just a big puddle of goo that predated the universe.
Where did goo come from?
Well, that's the first thing. Where did goo come from? Absolutely. But the second thing is, how can that goo make the universe that we have, right? Well, the bottom line is, we've already shown from the argument that the universe needs an explanation for its existence, and that explanation, we've all agreed, needs to be necessary. It could either be a necessary being or a necessary substance, right? That's kind of the only two choices, a being or a substance. So let's look at those two things. What is a necessary being? Well, it's a non-physical necessary mind or power. Has intelligence and creative ability to create. Right? What about a necessary substance? Well, it's an existing material, but it doesn't have intelligence or power in and of itself. It's just bleh. So it can't then create. In order to answer the question, why is there something instead of nothing, you have to have an intelligence that is personal to decide to create. In other words, if you had just a necessary substance that predated the universe, it doesn't have a mind or intelligence to create, which are necessary things in order to bring about creation. Right? The table is a substance. It happens to be a contingent substance. But even if it were a necessary substance, that table could not make the decision to create. Everybody following? Okay. Some would say they would try to use quantum physics, quantum mechanics, in order to explain the universe. Okay? Here's how that goes. They would say, in a quantum vacuum, particles seem to pop in and out of existence in a quantum vacuum. If quantum particles can do that, then the universe can do that. There's a couple of problems with that. A quantum vacuum is not timeless, spaceless, immaterial, uncaused, changeless, or beginningless. A quantum vacuum, quite frankly, is not nothing. Nothing is no thing. Nothing. No thing. No energy, no power, no time, no space, no material. Nothing. Nothing. A quantum vacuum is not nothing. It's a swirling ball of energy. Why do they then say that? It's an observational error. The reason it looks to us as though quantum particles are popping in and out of existence is because we can't observe as energy becomes matter. You guys remember what's Einstein? If you know nothing else about Einstein's formulas and all that, what's the one formula you know? E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times twice of the speed of light, right? E is equal to mc squared. See, he was the first one to understand that energy and mass are completely related. That's why I say a quantum vacuum that has swirls of energy is not nothing. Now, Alexander Vilenkin had this quote, and I'm going to read it to you because I love how he said it. Mind you, Alexander Vilenkin is one of the world's most preeminent philosophers. Physicists, rather. He says, it is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. It probably takes about 40 minutes to do the Kalam well. So I would say that we stop here and that we, discuss today's argument, the Leibnitzian argument, and talk about it, and I'll answer any questions you have, and then we'll pick back up next week with the Kalam cosmological argument. Okay? So, with that, who's got questions?
All right, so if I got this one right myself, we've agreed that I can argue that I can think of a universe that does not exist. I cannot think of a universe that could exist on its own. Therefore, there has to be a necessary being to have the existence.
You hit the nail on the head. You hit the nail on the head. There is no reason the universe itself is necessary because, as you well put it, you can imagine the universe not existing.
So for any universe to exist, there has to be a necessary being in that case.
That's right. And the reason it can't be a necessary substance is that a substance does not have intelligence or volition or power to bring about the existence of the universe.
The vacuum argument is, in my mind, see if this is right, a vacuum is not absence of space and time. You need a space and you need time to have a vacuum. Therefore, there still is something, even though you have a vacuum, what you think is nothing.
Exactly. See, the argument from quantum mechanics has two problems, one of which is what you just mentioned in no uncertain terms, and that is this. When we talk about the beginning of the universe, what many people fail to understand is that it is not just the beginning of stars and moons and galaxies. It is the beginning of all time, space, and matter.
Does it say in the beginning it was timeless and void or something like that?
The earth was formless and void. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the before the universe existed, there was no time. There was no space. There was no matter. There was no energy. There was just God. And again, if you have a problem with the term God, then okay, there was a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, all-powerful creator of the universe. Again, I'm more happy calling God God. But you're right. Before the universe existed, there was nothing. One of the things that we will talk about next week is what Stephen Hawking tried to say. I think the name of his book was A Brief History of the Universe. But he says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself. Again, gravity is not nothing. And gravity is just the description of the attractive forces between two objects. If there are no objects for which gravity can work on, then it can't create itself. Okay? He, by the way, is also the one that said philosophy is dead, which is a hilarious statement because it's a philosophical statement. Yeah. Brightest man in the world, they said. In physics, maybe.
Well, see how effective this would be, because they're denying that a God exists, but then just by this reasoning, it's very easy to you've got a necessary being. Now we're just working on it later.
Yes. Yeah, you're talking semantics. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's right.
And then you can go down the path of why my God is the necessary being.
That's exactly right. And that's why we talked, what was it, 2 weeks ago, I think, about this is why we're doing a classical apologetic approach here. Number one, because to me it's the most logical way to go through all of apologetics. But number two, because in our goal, what we're ultimately wanting to do is convert, everyone, atheists specifically. And so if you're, perhaps I should say the toughest thing to do is to convert an atheist. A Muslim at least believes God exists. A Jew at least believes God exists. A Mormon at least believes God exists. But an atheist says there is no God, right? So step one, show that God exists. Step two, show that my God is the correct God.
I think that while it's philosophical in a lot of these are scientific arguments as well. If somebody wants to argue the science portion of this, the same ammunition goes.
That's right. Yeah, and that's why I spent so much time on talking about the principle of sufficient reason. Because if you try to deny the principle of sufficient reason, science falls apart. You cannot do science unless you understand that everything has a reason for its existence. Otherwise, science just doesn't even make sense. You're just juggling balls for no reason. Because
if the whole universe came from two atoms colliding together, where those two atoms come from.
Right.
You still have to have a creator at some point. You can't ignore the fact that nothing can ever come out of nothing. That there has to be a creator for something to come from nothing.
I love, and R.C. Sproul, he's a Calvinist, and so there are some things that I don't agree with him on, but in his systematic theology, he is amazing. If you guys ever, if you ever really want to really listen to some amazing systematic theology, listen to R.C. Sproul. You got to be kind of a.
You got to be a nerd.
You got to be a nerd. Thanks, Todd.
Yes. Listen, it's true. I love it.
But R.C. Sproul probably does the best job of talking about the concept of God, right? What is God? And he uses that Latin phrase, ex nihilo nihil fit, a lot. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Nothing is no thing. No thing, no thing, nothing. It is nothing. There is no time, there is no space, there is no matter, there is no energy. Nothing. And because of that, and that alone, which, yes, is a scientific principle, but is also a philosophical principle, that leads you to an uncaused, necessary first cause. And again, if you'd rather call God an uncaused, necessary first cause, be my guest. I talk too slow for that. I don't want to call it God. I don't want to call it that. I want to call it God. Because I believe God is God.
So would it be true to say for anything to be eternal, it has to exist outside of time, because time itself requires a beginning and an end?
That's correct. Yep. You hit it.
I would also, and we did this before, just get back to the thing about the heaven. That's why Paul said he was called into the third heaven.
Yes.
They actually describe three heavens. If you remember in the Bible, the first heaven is the skies and what they could see. The second heaven was the universe, and the third heaven was the home of God, where God is. So when you read third heaven, that's what Paul was talking about, because they didn't have that word described.
Right.
Well, that leads into that. I know we'll get into it, but when people go, well, then who created God?
Right. But that's right, exactly. That's why you can't have an infinite number of contingent reasons, right? Because then you do run into what they call an infinite regress, right? See, and that's a misunderstanding and a straw man when an atheist asks you, well, who caused God? We don't believe that anything or anyone caused God. He is the uncaused first cause, right? He is not a contingent being.
Being.
Correct. Now,
they infinitely keep going.
That's right.
You take a necessary being, you create a necessary being, you create a necessary
right. Now, that is one of the things that separates us from Mormons. Because remember, Mormons believe that God, Elohim, they call, or Heavenly Father, came from another planet to populate ours. And that there is an infinite regress of gods in Mormonism. Right.
So therefore, I can be a necessary being under Mormonism.
Under Mormonism, right.
Under Mormonism, I get my own planet and I become a necessary being.
Exactly. See, they run into a philosophical problem because they've got a contingent being, God of our world. The problem is that you've got to have an uncaused first cause.
But they don't.
It
allows them to be
correct.
Yeah.
They also have some interesting thoughts about the beginning of the universe. They believe that God formed it out of pre-existing matter. But my point here is that that is an infinite regress, because ultimately you do have to ask, well, who was the first one? Because there had to have at some point been a first one.
Well, that explains a lot for me in one of the conversations I had in one of my minutes.
With a Mormon, yeah. If you, yeah. Now, next week, one of the concepts that we'll talk about is, and this will make even more sense about today's discussion, is an actual infinite cannot exist. An actual infinite cannot exist.
To get the method, that's at the beginning of the end to be considered infinite.
See, here's the thing. The concept of the infinite as we learned it in mathematics, is a concept. It is not meant to be a reality. It never was, even in math. And we'll talk a lot about this next week, about how an actual infinite is a self-defeating principle, even mathematically. Okay? Because, like we all think about when you learned math, what you thought an infinite was. It was like, okay, well, you can always add another one, right? Or an infinite in the back would be you always can subtract one more. That's actually logically impossible in an actual world. The concept of infinity is just that. It is a mathematical concept. Actual infinites don't exist. It is logically incoherent. And I'll show you how exactly. I have like 4 slides next week that will show you. This is why I said even the Kalam is going to take a good 45 minutes to do, because that is one of the things that we're going to look at, is that an actual infinite, therefore an actually infinite universe, is impossible. It is absolutely impossible.
Okay. If you have a conversation about someone who talks about the Big Bang Theory,
Yes.
okay, can you then say to them, okay, God breathed this, and this is what happened, or God, how do you explain God to somebody that believes in the Big Bang Theory? I mean,
Yeah. Well,
I've had people say to me, well, maybe God just blew his breath out, and that was the Big Bang Theory. Possible, as far as I'm concerned.
correct. Yeah. Okay.
know.
So there's a couple ways. The first thing is this. I would point out to them that the last of those 3 words is the word theory. Okay? It is not a fact. Okay? Why is it not a fact? Because by definition, you can't make it happen again and observe it. Okay, and record it. No one was there except God. And so it's a theory. Okay? The second thing is, and so I would actually ask them instead to use a different use a scientific term, because I guarantee you start using godly terms, they're going to start shutting off their brain. So use another scientific term, the singularity. All the singularity means is basically the same thing. That first instant of existence, that single point where all time, space, and matter came into existence. Okay? It doesn't, to even a Christian, matter whether it was God sneezing, God breathing, God speaking. It doesn't matter. It simply matters that before that, there was no time, there was no space, there was no matter. God to us is the uncaused first cause of everything, of time, of space, of matter, of energy. And so again, perhaps the best way to talk to them is simply to use those terms. I won't even use the term God with you. I'll simply say that when the universe came into existence at the singularity, all time, space, and matter came into existence. What I call God is simply the uncaused first cause of the universe. Because the truth of the matter is, none of us were there to know exactly how God did it. And perhaps the more important question even is what Leibniz asked, which is, why? What science can never answer is why there is a universe instead of nothing. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay.
Like I said, the key is getting them to admit that there must be a necessary being.
Yes.
That's it.
There has to be a necessary, and if they don't want to call it a being, then let them call it a necessary, uncaused first cause. If they don't want to call God a being, fine. let them not call God a being. It does not matter. You and I know God is a being, but if they don't want to call it a being, let them not call it a being. Let them call it an uncaused, necessary first cause. Entity, yeah, exactly.
Something.
Yeah. Now, if they try to say to you it's an uncaused substance, then you can point out to them, no, that's logically not possible. But if they want to use the term cause or entity or whatever instead of being, because they don't like the term being, let them have that. Ultimately, they'll come to understand that that's a
The
being.
whole word substance, it defies their argument from nothing, because,
Right.
I mean, it defies that.
Ex nihilo
Substance
nihil fit.
had- and something had to make substance.
Out of nothing, nothing comes. That's right.
Go.
All right, guys. We'll see y'all next week for the Kalam. One of my favorites. We hope that you enjoyed the content of our video today. If you did, make sure to give us a thumbs up and share this content. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so that you are alerted to any new content that we post on our channel. Please remember that all of our video content is completely free of charge and can be reposted, shared, and embedded. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/armorofgodapologetics with an S. Thank you for watching and have a blessed day.